You stink. It's 1350, and you've just spent 5 days hauling firewood, shoveling pig muck, and sleeping in the same tunic. The air around you is thick with sweat, smoke, and a layer of something you can't quite name. But today's different. You're not heading to a bucket in a freezing shed. You're walking to the town bathhouse, a steamy, crowded room filled with strangers, gossip, cheap wine, and maybe a tooth pulling if you're unlucky. This isn't the fantasy of knights and castles. It's the real Middle Ages, where getting clean was a social ritual, a class privilege, and sometimes considered a sin. So how did people actually deal with grime, stink, and disease in a world without deodorant or modern plumbing? Let's scrub away the myths, starting with your feet. In medieval towns and cities, water wasn't just a necessity. It shaped the rhythm of public life. The idea that hygiene was a private, lonely struggle ignores how deeply communal the act of getting clean actually was. For many, especially those living in crowded urban neighborhoods, bathing was one of the most social events of the week. Imagine yourself as a leather tanner in 14th century London, living near the bustling riverbanks of Southwark. After a week spent in the thick, pungent air of your workshop, you'd head to the local public bathhouse, or stew. These stews were as much a part of city life as the market or the church, woven into the daily routine of ordinary people. Stepping inside, you'd be met with a rush of warm, humid air and the overlapping sounds of conversation. The main room was filled with large wooden tubs, each big enough to fit a dozen people comfortably. Steam hung heavy above the water, and the clatter of wooden cups and plates echoed as bathers ate and drank without ever leaving the tubs. In these crowded rooms, news traveled fast. You might overhear a shipper complaining about new taxes, a baker whispering about a nobleman's scandal, or a group of masons debating the progress on the city's latest cathedral. Deals were struck, gossip was traded, and friendships were formed, all while people soaked away the week's grime. These bathhouses were the social networks of their time, where business, leisure, and hygiene blended into a single, noisy experience. To get clean, you'd use a basic soap made from boiled animal fat and ash, good enough to cut through the sweat and grease of manual labor. It didn't smell pleasant, but it worked, and most townspeople could afford it, or at least access it through local markets. Cleanliness wasn't a luxury reserved for the elite. It was something urban dwellers pursued together, side by side in the steamy haze. Bathhouses offered more than just a bath. In a corner, a barber surgeon might set up shop, offering shaves, haircuts, and sometimes more serious procedures. You could watch someone have a tooth pulled or a wound dressed, all in plain view of the other bathgoers. This mix of services made stews a one-stop shop for bodily upkeep. The importance of bathhouses is clear from town records, which list their owners, the regulations they had to follow, and the specific days men and women could attend. Archaeological evidence shows heated floors and basic piping in some urban bathhouses, proof of a society that invested in public infrastructure for hygiene. This communal approach to cleanliness stands in stark contrast to the image of a solitary peasant hunched over a bucket of cold water. While that was reality for many in the countryside, urban dwellers enjoyed a shared, almost festive approach to bathing. The bathhouse was a rare space where social boundaries blurred. People of different trades and classes sat together in a state of undress, talking, eating, and relaxing in a way that was impossible outside those walls. In these steamy rooms, cleanliness meant connection as much as it did hygiene. Yet, this openness was not without its problems. The sight of men and women bathing together, sharing food and drink, and conducting business in various states of undressed began to worry religious and civic authorities. The freedom and social mixing that made bathhouses so popular also made them controversial. The system that had provided a sophisticated model for public hygiene was more fragile than it seemed, and its benefits were never shared equally. Access depended on your place in society and, most of all, on your ability to pay. But why did such a central institution face mounting moral criticism? Cleanliness in the Middle Ages wasn't just a matter of soap and water, it was a matter of class. Step into a medieval bathhouse and you'd see the difference almost immediately. A merchant reclines in a warm tub of herbal water sipping spiced wine. A peasant, by contrast, might be huddled over a cracked wooden basin in a cold, dirt-floored hut rubbing his skin raw with sand or lye. Both valued cleanliness, only one could afford it. Take two men from the same year, say 1342. One is a wealthy wool merchant living in Britain, the other a tenant farmer scraping out a living on rough land in rural England. Both sweat, both stink, both want to wash, but what that looks like couldn't be more different. The merchant's home boasts thick stone walls and tiled floors. He has a chamber set aside just for bathing, what some records call a stewing room. Servants heat buckets of water and fill a large wooden tub lined with linen sheets to prevent splinters. The water is hot, clean, and sometimes steeped in herbs, like thyme or bay leaves. He bathes weekly, maybe more, using luxury soaps, imported Castile bars from Spain or olive oil blends from Damascus. They don't just clean, they smell of citrus, laurel, and wealth. The peasant, he bathes when he can, which usually means not often. Water must be hauled by hand, bucket by bucket, from the village well. Each load is heavy, each fire to heat it precious. A full bath might mean hours of labor just to draw on warm enough water. So instead of bathing, most peasants settle for wiping down with a cloth or splashing their face and hands in cold water. In winter, when water freezes solid and firewood is rationed, even that becomes a challenge. His soap, if he's lucky, it's a hard block of homemade lye soap, a gritty, stinging mixture of ash and animal fat that burns cracks into his skin. If not, he'll grab whatever's on hand. A scoop of wood ash, a pinch of sand, a torn scrap of linen dipped in snowmelt. The goal isn't comfort, it's survival. Imagine scrubbing yourself clean with coarse sand after a week spent slopping pigs and digging ditches. No rose-scented water, no servants, just raw hands, cold floors, and skin rubbed pink from friction. But the divide doesn't stop at the bath itself. It clings to clothes, to skin, to scent. The wealthy merchant and his family smell faintly of lavender. Their linens are washed regularly, folded into chests lined with sachets of dried herbs and flower petals. A lady of status might perfume her undergarments with oils or rub her wrists with a pomander of clove and cinnamon. When they walk past, you smell cleanliness. The poor, however, were the grime of their labor. Their tunics absorb the smoke of hearth fires, the musk of livestock, and the sharp tamps of sweat soaked deep into cloth that rarely sees soap. Their boots track manure, their fingernails stay black. A farmer's wife might own only 2 shifts, one on her body, one drying by the fire. When water's scarce, clothes stew in their own stink for weeks. And don't be fooled by the romantic images of simple country life. Many rural homes had earthen floors soaked with waste from animals and children. Lice and fleas were common. Mold grew on damp walls. Even if a woman like Elspeth scrubbed her face with a nettle rag each morning and scraped her fingernails with a sliver of bone, she couldn't scrub away poverty. Still, they tried. Peasants valued cleanliness, even if their tools were crude. Hands were rinsed before meals. Feet were washed before bed. In some households, a small basin sat by the hearth for nightly wiping down, but full-body bathing. That was a rare event, sometimes tied to holidays, childbirth, or ritual. Some bathed in rivers during summer, stripping down and diving into water already muddied by livestock. Others relied on sweat baths, cramped wooden saunas where steam softened grime enough to scrape it off with a dull blade. No towels, no bathrobes, just grit and willpower. The consequences of this divide weren't just cosmetic, they were deadly. The merchant's home likely had its own well, drawn from groundwater, not runoff. A primitive latrine drained waste outside the living space. That meant cleaner drinking water and fewer waterborne diseases. His children had a fighting chance. But for peasants, water might come from the same stream where pigs wallowed, clothes were rinsed, and waste was dumped. Diarrhea, dysentery, and cholera didn't care if you washed your hands. Filth could kill. And yet, it wasn't that the poor accepted dirt, it was that they were at war with it, every day. A war against sweat, stink, parasites, and illness. A war fought with cold hands, cracked heels, and broken fingernails. One bucket of water at a time. Cleanliness, in the Middle Ages, was not a habit. It was a luxury, a badge of wealth, a sign that you had the time and resources to fight back against the mess of daily life. And that's why the idea of medieval people as universally filthy is so misleading. The rich were often cleaner than we are today. The poor, they fought harder than we realize just to be less dirty. But even for the rich, cleanliness had limits. Because when it came to laundry, even silk gowns and scented soap weren't enough. You could bathe in olive oil and rose water, but sooner or later you had to wash your clothes. And that meant turning to a cleaning agent no medieval household could live without. Meet Marjorie. She's been up since dawn, tending her fire, hauling water, and sorting through a week's worth of sweat-soaked linen. Her hands are already raw, and the worst part of the day hasn't even begun. Because Marjorie is what her village calls a lotrek, and that means she's about to wade knee into a tub of urine.
Yeah.
In medieval Europe, keeping your body clean was one battle, but keeping your clothes clean, that required chemistry, grit, and an iron stomach. Marjorie didn't have modern detergents, but she had something better, or at least something stronger. Lant, aged, fermented urine. It might sound revolting now, but back then, this was just smart science. People didn't know what ammonia was, but they did know that if you left a chamber pot full of pee sitting by the hearth for a week or two, the result could strip grease out of fabric like magic. And that magic was critical for women like Marjorie, who worked long hours scrubbing away the daily grime of a village full of farmers, butchers, and blacksmiths. In her small cottage, tucked near the outskirts of town, Marjorie kept several ceramic pots tucked behind the hearth, conveniently out of sight, but close enough to keep warm. Over time, the liquid inside transformed, growing sharper, smellier, and much more effective. It was common practice across Europe. In some places, entire households collected their own urine in jugs and jars, saving it for the next wash. What we might call disgusting, Marjorie would call essential. On laundry day, She loaded the soiled garments, coarse wool tunics, linen, and the occasional lord's embroidered sleeve into large wooden tubs. Then she poured in the land. Once the clothes were thoroughly soaked, she hoisted up her skirts and climbed into the vat herself. Why? Because the best way to work the solution into the fabric was to stamp on it. With bare feet, she would mash and tread the soaked garments for hours, the ammonia biting at the cracked skin on her heels. This process, known as fulling, wasn't just for cleaning. It was part dance, part endurance trial, and part public service. Marjorie wasn't alone. Across towns and villages, thousands of women did this exact same thing, scrubbing, stamping, and wringing clothes until they could be hung out to dry. And if you're wondering how long it took to get the smell out, well, that's where rivers came in. Once the stamping was done, Marjorie hauled the dripping fabrics to the riverbank. There, she rinsed each item again and again, letting the current carry off the remaining stench. It took time, it took strength, and it took resilience, especially in the dead of winter, when the water stung like ice and the wind cut through her wet skirts. But Marjorie's work didn't just matter. It defined her. Clean clothes meant dignity. They meant health. They meant a household that could walk into church or the marketplace without shame. And so, medieval society depended on women like her, even if they rarely noticed them. This wasn't just a household chore either. Your empowered laundering scaled up to industry. In towns across England and France, fullers like Marjorie had professional counterparts, often men working in fulling mills along the rivers. These mills took in newly woven wool, soaked it in massive vats of lant, and used mechanical hammers to beat it into shape. Because raw wool was loaded with lanolin, a greasy, waxy coating that had to be stripped before the fabric could be dyed or sold. And urine was the answer. In fact, the demand was so high that some towns placed public barrels in the streets, asking citizens to contribute their donations. In a few cities, land became so valuable it was taxed or sold, making it one of the few human byproducts that actually appreciated in value the longer it sat. Marjorie might not have known the word ammonia, but she knew this much. Nothing else got a tunic truly clean. Still, her job was exhausting. By sundown, her arms ached, her skin stung, and her clothes smelled faintly of the very garments she had tried to clean. She'd carry the finished laundry back home, hang it to dry, and start collecting fresh urine for the next week. This system worked, until it didn't. Because while the chemistry stayed the same, the culture was shifting. Bathhouses were already under fire from the church, who saw too much skin and too much pleasure for their liking. And soon, an even greater fear would arrive. One that didn't just cast bathing as sinful, but as deadly. Linen could help you stay clean. Perfume could mask the smell. But what happened when even water itself was seen as a threat? Marjorie's tools, her tubs, her lant, her riverside rituals suddenly weren't enough. The world was about to change, and it would hit hardest for the people who had worked the hardest to stay clean. Imagine it's Sunday morning. You've bathed the night before, scrubbed your arms, rinsed your hair, wrapped yourself in clean linen. The bathhouse had been crowded, as usual, but comforting. Steam clung to the walls, and someone played a lute by the furnace. You felt warm, renewed, and ready for Mass. But now, as the priest climbs into the pulpit, his voice changes. He begins to speak of temptation, how water softens the flesh, how heat opens the pores and the soul to sin. He quotes a bishop: "Bathing stirs lust and idleness, and invites the devil to crawl in with the steam." You look down at your clean hands and wonder, did you just invite damnation? This wasn't a fringe idea. By the 14th century, the church had started to turn against the bathhouse. For centuries, public bathing had been a place of health, community, and even charity. Monasteries operated bathhouses for pilgrims. Cities taxed them like taverns. In many towns, they were as common as bakeries. But slowly, sermons grew harsher. Bathing became associated with vanity, indulgence, and fleshly temptation, especially in mixed-gender establishments. Priests warned of men and women mingling behind fogged glass and wet linens. Rumors swirled of unholy conduct between soap and steam. And the bathhouse itself, it began to shift. What had once been a place of healing became, in some cities, a place of brothels and bribes. Bath attendants accepted extra coins for extra services. Merchants scheduled business deals alongside illicit rendezvous. Some bathhouses became known not for cleanliness but for corruption. This shift didn't happen overnight. It unfolded over decades, through papal edicts, local crackdowns, and mounting public unease. But it reshaped everything. Because now, bathing wasn't just health, it was risk. Take Queen Isabella of Castile. Historians often misquote her as saying she only bathed twice in her life. That's not quite true, but the rumor persisted because it felt true. Royalty, after all, had begun to embrace dry cleanliness, changing linen instead of washing skin, masking odor with herbs and perfume, and leaving water to the poor and the sinful. To be seen entering a bathhouse too often, that was suspect, a sign of excess, or worse, moral decay. And this wasn't limited to Spain. In Florence, Paris, London, city by city, bathhouses fell under suspicion. Some were taxed out of existence, others quietly shut down. Still others were repurposed, their tubs removed, their fires extinguished. For the devout, cleanliness now came from within. Pilgrims were told to wash their souls, not their bodies. Monks embraced the scent of sanctities and wore the same robe for months, believing humility was more important than hygiene. Washing too often could be seen as vanity, or worse, pride. But people didn't abandon cleanliness overnight. They adapted. Instead of public baths, they bathed at home when they could. They embraced linen washing as a gentler, drier alternative. They turned to herbal fumigation, scented pouches, and ritual hand washing, not out of laziness, but out of caution. Because when the church began to equate hot water with hot sign, even a humble bath could feel dangerous. Still, the body doesn't care about doctrine. It sweats, stinks, and soils itself all the same. And people, especially women like Marjorie, kept fighting the dirt, even if quietly. But bathhouses, their golden age was fading. What had once been hubs of hygiene and humanity, places where peasants soaked beside nobles, where stories were shared and bodies healed, were now haunted by whispers of immorality and disease. The bath, once a source of renewal, had become a symbol of risk. And then, just when the heat of that cultural shift was building, the world went cold, because something far worse than gossip or sermons was about to pour across Europe. A terror that made soap, steam, and clean skin feel meaningless. A darkness that turned every cough into a death sentence, and every crowd, every bathhouse into a tomb. The bathhouse is quiet now, its doors are shuttered. The fire in the furnace has gone cold. Steam no longer curls from the windows. The laughter, the gossip, the warm splash of water, all gone. Outside, the air carries the scent of ash, and something much worse. It's 1348, and the Black Death has arrived. At first it was just a whisper, a cough here, a strange rash there. Then came the fever, the blackened boils, and the sudden, suffocating deaths. Families locked themselves indoors. Merchants abandoned their stalls. Streets filled with the sound of carts creaking under the weight of bodies, and the bathhouse, that warm, crowded room once full of life, now looked like a death trap. Because if the plague could travel on breath, on skin, on clothes, then any space full of steam and strangers was a danger. The very places people once went to cleanse themselves now felt like they might kill you. No one knew about bacteria. No one understood airborne transmission. But they sensed the danger. They saw the pattern. The bathers died first. People began to avoid hot water, communal spaces, and close contact. The church, already suspicious of bathing, doubled down. Monks preached that the plague was a punishment for sin, and that exposing your body in a bathhouse was part of the problem. Cleanliness now meant distance. It meant linen, smoke, and silence. And still, the bodies piled up. In cities like Florence, entire families vanished in days. In London, the death toll was so high that gravediggers ran out of land and time. In Paris, doctors stuffed their noses with herbs, covered their bodies in waxed cloth, and still died screaming. Imagine Marjorie again. She's not in the bathhouse now. She's outside it, clutching a bundle of damp linen to her chest, watching the door swing shut for the last time. Her neighbor died 3 days ago. Her son is coughing. She hasn't touched water in over a week. She wipes her hands on her apron and whispers a prayer, not for health but for mercy. Because even though she knows how to clean, how to scrub and scour and soak, it no longer matters. Soap can't save her now. Across Europe, hygiene collapses, not from ignorance, but from terror. People stop washing, not because they're lazy, but because they're scared. Water becomes suspect. Steam becomes a curse. Touch itself becomes a threat. Doctors tell people to stay dry, to change linen instead of bathing, to fumigate their homes with sulfur and rosemary, to carry pomanders filled with cloves, not to smell nice but to ward off death. And for the wealthy, this new fear becomes a philosophy. They wear layers of clean linen and change it obsessively. They believe that linen draws out the dirt, pulling impurities from the skin. They wipe instead of washing. They dry scrub instead of soaking. And they burn herbs in copper basins to cleanse the air. This is how the myth begins. The idea that real cleanliness doesn't come from water but from dryness, distance, and divine protection. That a fragrant cloth is safer than a warm bath. That smell is less dangerous than sin. The bathhouse, once a beacon of social health, becomes a ghost. Some are boarded up forever. Others are repurposed into storage, workshops, or plague wards. The great communal ritual of washing, once tied to laughter, healing, and shared humanity, is reduced to a memory. In its place, ash linen and fear. And for those who survive, that fear doesn't fade. Even after the plague wanes, many people keep their new habits. They cling to the dry, the distant, and the perfume. The old ways, Marjorie's scrubbing, the bathhouse's steam. The shared rituals of sweat and soap become relics, stories, warnings. And centuries later, when modern people look back at the Middle Ages, they don't see the hot baths or the herbal rinses. They don't see the effort, the innovation, or the fight for dignity. They just see dirt. They remember the grime, the plague, the stink, and assume people didn't care, that they were lazy, filthy, barbaric. But the truth is, more painful than that. They cared, they fought, and then they were afraid. So, were medieval people filthy? Sometimes. Yes, but not because they didn't care. They cared deeply about dignity, health, and smell. They washed with what they had, when they could. They soaked linen in urine, rubbed teeth with ash, and fought filth with fire, steam, and brute effort. But then came fear. The church said bathing tempted sin. The plague made water itself feel dangerous. And slowly, staying clean became an act of faith or of defiance. We look back and laugh at their grime. But that's the trap, because every culture thinks its habits are normal, that its rituals make sense. So here's the real question. Centuries from now, what will people think about us? Our perfumes, our plastics, our obsession with hand sanitizer. Maybe one day we'll be the ones who smell off. These stories shows how our own habits are shaped by what we believe about science and health. What modern practice might future generations misinterpret about us? If this blew your mind, hit like and subscribe for more of history's hidden twists.